Hi there, I'm Ben Pearson. Welcome to the Tech World Human Skills Podcast. Every episode we talk through how to thrive in the tech world, not just survive. Now, if you want me to work with your team, just give me a shout. I love to help teams to be more influential, memorable and successful with their stakeholders. Head over to www.techworldhumanskills.com to book a chat. Hi everyone, and welcome to the podcast. Another episode talking about the skills that you need as a human to thrive in tech. And today we're talking about something that I know very little about. We are talking about note making. We're talking about the difference between scribbling down notes on a piece of paper and your own personal knowledge management system. Now, to help us with the conversation, we have a senior developer advocate at Grafana. But not only that, she runs a brilliant YouTube channel. So please welcome to the show, Nicole van der Hoeven. Nicole, it's lovely to have you on the show.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Ben. Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be invited.
Well, thank you for giving us your time, your energy and your knowledge as we talk about this topic. I wonder, could we start off like we normally do, really? Could you introduce yourself so that everybody knows a little bit about you?
Sure. Hi, I'm Nicole. I currently live sometimes in the Netherlands, sometimes in Portugal. I've been in tech for, about 15 years now. I've been a performance engineer. Most recently, I've been a developer advocate. And in my free time, I guess, I did this passion project that was my YouTube channel about taking notes. Like, who knew that people would be interested in that? And it has spiraled into a whole thing because I am unwilling to let that go now that people are willing to hear me talk about it.
So I mean, yeah, I'll be honest. I didn't really realise. I mean, so the work for context for everybody else. I did an episode with Whitney, and Whitney, after we'd done the episode, was like, "You need to talk to Nicole. Nicole would be brilliant." And this is the topic of note taking and personal knowledge management, which, to be honest, I'd never really thought much about until we started talking about it a few months ago. Probably a few weeks ago that we first had our first conversation. So why is it that you're so interested in notes?
Well, I've always been a note taker. Like in school, I was the kid whose notes everybody borrowed. And I think that I really just needed it when I tend to get lost. When I'm talking to someone, if I'm not taking notes, I don't feel fully invested or fully involved or engaged. And so that is actually my way of focusing. But also, in my job, I don't sort of tend to stay with one company or one project and then just be there for years. I'm the kind of person that was called in to fix something specific. And that means learning very quickly. Or trying to anyway.
Okay, so your background is that you like taking notes. You were always the person that takes notes. And if I remember correctly, tech wasn't your original background. That's not what you did at college. That's not how you started off in your career.
No, not at all. I had no idea what I wanted to do for my career. I shifted majors 6 times over 2 countries and 3 schools, and I eventually ended up with economics because at that point I had so many math classes that was the fastest way to graduate. And my parents were like, I don't care if it's basket weaving, just pick something, finish it. And I have never used that degree since.
And so you've been in the tech world pretty much since?
Yes, I think there's a lot of imposter syndrome there. Like, who am I to go into computer science? I'm not that smart. I'm not a techie. And I think that's also why I fell into taking notes, because I'm like, okay, even if I'm not the smartest or the best programmer, I am going to take those notes and I'm not going to forget anything. Like, that's my superpower. That's how I cope.
Okay. And so what's your experience of other people? I mean, I must admit, so I'm sort of now reflecting on my own note taking and note making, and we'll talk about the difference in that a bit later. But if I think about my own note taking, I've often got a pad around. I like to scribble stuff down, really just because when I'm in a meeting or something, it helps it go into my brain. If I've just written down a word, written down a sentence, but then if I think about my notes, they're all there in OneNote. That's what I use. I've got a Microsoft background, so I use OneNote. They're all there, but they're not really very structured. They're searchable because they're text, but and that's probably my knowledge management system, is all the stuff that I've scribbled down either in these notebooks I've got or that's sat on OneNote in a not a massively organised way. But what's your experience of other people's? What's it like in our industry? What are people's personal knowledge management systems or note making skills like?
Yeah, I think that's part of the problem, that people don't distinguish between note taking and note making. And this is a distinction that I actually picked up from a guy named Nick Milo, who's amazing. And he said that what we call notes is really notes that we've taken, and that just means someone says a thing, I write it down as quickly as I can, verbatim if I can, just trying to get down what that person has said or what we've heard. So we're more recording what has happened. Note making is entirely different. Note making is going back on those notes afterwards and being a little bit more critical about it. So that could be like, the first step would be paraphrasing it in your own words, but later steps could be like thinking about how that relates to other notes that you've made and other concepts that you've come across. And do they conflict with other ideas that you've already put into your system? Just being a little bit more aware of what else you can take out of this other than just what was said. Like, what is the underlying concept behind this, even if that wasn't exactly mentioned?
Okay, so note making is a more considered, almost like a second phase that happens to document the knowledge that you've gained, as opposed to note taking, which is when you're there in the present, jotting down the stuff in the meeting whilst you're watching the video, at the conference, wherever it might be.
Yeah, so maybe it would be good to come up with an example. For example, if I go to like a conference talk on Kubernetes 101, I could take those notes, and that would just be me going through what the speaker is saying or what the lecturer is saying, and I would have a note on what Kubernetes is and maybe how to get started with it. Afterwards, though, I would then make notes from that. I would look at not just Kubernetes, but like what trend is Kubernetes kind of piggybacking off of? Well, it could be containerization. Well, Kubernetes isn't the only container we've ever had. Docker is also a type of container. Why does it make sense? Why is this a computing concept that putting containers around something is somehow makes it better? Well, maybe that goes back to the principle of atomicity. It's easier when you have building blocks rather than this whole big thing. Well, maybe that's also related to microservices and monoliths. So now you're starting to think of not just Kubernetes, but what it represents, the concepts behind it. And this is the way that I try to make sense of things in my head, because I don't have a computer science degree. I never studied it formally. What I know from practice and from Google Foo, basically. So I have to figure my way out in an industry that isn't always the most friendly.
Right. No, that's really interesting. That's a brilliant example. Thank you for sharing that. It sort of brings it alive a little bit, doesn't it? So I wonder, before we get into the how, because I'm desperate to get into the how, and I've already made a note of a little question that I want to ask you later. Let's talk me through the benefits, because people listening to this that are thinking, oh, this sounds like it's going to be a bit of effort, right? So what are the benefits of getting really good at note taking and note making?
Yeah, I'm not going to try to sugarcoat it. It is a lot of effort. It definitely is. I've spent a lot of time doing this, but the benefits are pretty significant. One, for me, as I said, it helps me focus, and it also genuinely helps me learn. Like, this isn't a thing that I'm doing to prove I've learned. This is how I learn. The writing and the taking notes is the process of learning. It also helps me feel less like an imposter because I'm just taking notes. I'm not creating content or being an expert. I'm like, here are my notes. This is me learning. So it seems much more accessible and much less daunting. And then there's also the huge benefit of the fact that I never have to have a portfolio, and I don't have to curate a portfolio. Like I haven't applied like a cold apply for a job in the last 10 years. It's always been word of mouth because my work and my notes speak for themselves. I'm not saying they're brilliant and perfect, but when you see tens of thousands of notes from someone about a particular topic, their passion is undeniable.
And so your notes are publicly available. So your notes aren't just things that are kept on your own OneNote or whatever software you use. They're available for others to see.
Yes, most of them anyway. I mean, I definitely have private notes, like notes on people or confidential meetings and stuff that I don't publish, but as a rule, I try to publish almost everything, especially
Right. So
for around tech and that kind of thing.
okay. So not only is it helping you learn, but you're publishing it so that others can see. So when you're getting a job or something like that, they can just go and look at all the things that you've studied. There's like a record of whether you've studied it or not. But I guess also it's sort of giving a bit back, is it? I mean, do you know people that go and use your notes as a reference for themselves?
Absolutely. I mean, it goes to even my colleagues sometimes. They're like, I often get them saying, "Oh, I was going to ask you what you thought about this thing, but then I just looked in your notes and I found a note where you talk exactly about your opinion on this very topic. So thanks for that." Or I just get random people, like not even related to me, doing Google searches. I mean, there are some applications or tools that I've taken notes on, and I've actually gotten feedback that my notes are better than their documentation. Which is such it's amazing. It's really a huge compliment. But really, I'm writing for myself. This is like my personal Google, my personal Wikipedia. So I write for myself first, but I do love hearing from people that say like, "Oh, thank you so much for just telling me how to get started and not like trying to sell me on the tool or whatever it is or the conceptual part of it." Sometimes I just want to get started.
And how is that? Because I know it's another topic you're passionate about is this idea of learning in public. So as well as note making, but learning in public. How does that work out? Because I imagine there's parts of that can be brilliant, but you're also quite vulnerable, I guess, learning in public. You're also open to other people's critique and comment or trolling or, how is that sort of learning in public?
Oh, absolutely, it requires vulnerability. Yes. It definitely isn't easy, but I really find that I learn so much faster when I'm learning in public. So I'm the kind of person that has a history of learning things she has no business learning.
Okay.
Like I learned Dutch in 3 months and then got a job and moved to the Netherlands where I was speaking entirely in Dutch, and this was a tech job. How did I do that? It's not because I'm really good at languages or anything. I put in the time and I learned in public. Like for 3 months every day, I was posting a video to this online community, and I got a lot of feedback about what I was saying wrong and how I could do better. And I got a lot of offers of like conversational partners. I'm the kind of person like who will apply to speak at a conference about chaos engineering, not having ever done any chaos engineering, and then learning how to do it in a couple months and documenting the entire process. And being able to send my notes to my colleague and being like, "Hey, what have I got wrong here?"
Yeah.
That's just so much easier than going to the same colleague who's an expert and saying, "Can you teach me everything you know about chaos engineering?" They're like,
Yeah.
"Okay, I my time is valuable." But if
Yeah.
I say, "Here's the work that I've done my best to try and figure this out. Can you just kind of spot where I went astray?" It just helps so much, and it's so much easier. It saves me months of trying to figure that stuff out for myself. And I feel so strongly about learning in public that I'm actually writing a book about it, which I'm also writing in public.
Okay, so you're writing it chapter by chapter, freely available, with anybody able to go and see the chapters as you're writing them.
Exactly. I was actually inspired by Brandon Sanderson. He's a fiction
Okay,
writer,
I know I've read his
and
books. Yeah.
oh, he's so good. He's one of my favorite authors. But one of his books, Warbreaker, he actually wrote in public chapter by chapter. And it
Okay.
was rough. It was not like secretly he worked on it for months and then is releasing it every day, trickle feeding it. No, he was really releasing it really raw. And so there were characters whose genders changed because he decided it would be better and he just kept writing. There was unfinished dialogue. There were plot threads that were scrapped altogether in the final iteration. It was fascinating, and as a budding writer, I learned more about writing from reading his unfinished work in progress than
Yeah.
I did from reading the finished product.
Yeah.
And that's what I want to do for people. And I've only just started writing the book. Announcing it was pretty scary. And
Yeah.
yes, there's a lot of vulnerability there, like you said. But I've already gotten a lot of feedback. I'll mention something offhand, and then people are like, wait, wait, wait. What is that? Tell me more about that. I'm like, oh, all right. Let me make this into a whole chapter. Like I didn't realize that's a thing that resonates with people.
Yeah.
And that's not a thing that I would have gotten if I had, hunkered down for a year in the dark in my basement, released this big thing, and then people would have been like, actually kind of missed the mark in chapter
Yeah.
one.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's interesting. As you say that, I sort of reflect years ago, and this is more than 10 years ago now. I used to run a technical blog when I was working at Microsoft. And I think about the blog articles and the things that I would write and the usefulness to other people, how much they were read and the comments and the feedback you get back. And I remember the first thing I wrote was like the most simple. I was doing PowerShell at the time, and it was the most simple cheat sheet. It was literally, this is how you do an if statement. This is how you do, whatever it might be. All the really simple stuff, how you do an array or whatever it is. Release that. And it was just because I wanted to print it out and put it on my desk so that when I was starting, I could have a little reference to, look at on my desk. And I remember then, months later, doing some really deep work on virtual desktop infrastructure performance, how you optimized it. It could save you thousands and thousands if you were doing a big virtual desktop infrastructure deployment years ago. And nobody read it. Because it was so niche and it was so polished. But actually, nobody really needed it because there were probably only 5 people in the country doing that same project and that would benefit from it. But actually, the simple stuff and the learning in public was the stuff that was really popular. And it was funny because that was the first one was a throwaway from me, almost like pop it out there, but no one's going to be interested in this. And it was really, really valuable. And then the thing that I toiled over for hours and polished was of no value or no interest to anybody.
Yeah, I totally get it. There's no telling sometimes, and it's really, I think we do ourselves a disservice by having enough hubris to believe we know what other people want when we really don't. And
Yeah.
because we think we know, that causes us to just hold on to our work far longer than we really should, when we could have already been getting great feedback from day one.
Yeah. Now, one question I do want to ask you before we get into the how you do this, just talking about your approach to taking feedback. So when you were talking about learning Dutch, you said you got lots of feedback, and I'm imagining with many of your other bits of learning in public, you're getting lots of feedback. what sort of feedback do you get, and what's your approach to taking feedback?
Yeah, I am a woman in tech, and I'm also a woman on the internet, on
Okay.
YouTube. So I get a lot of feedback, and not all of it is good. So what
Okay.
I try to do is set up filters to kind of filter through the feedback that I even see. So for example, on YouTube, you can set keywords so that if a comment has a certain keyword, you'll never see it. Like if I'm talking about something about, related to a tech tutorial, I don't want to hear anything about how I look or anything, that's not what I'm talking about. So I
Yeah.
find those comments are just distracting, whether they're good or bad, because I've
Yeah.
gotten both sides. So
Yeah.
once I've filtered out all of that, then the rest of it is a little bit easier to deal with. I
Okay.
also tend to ignore the overwhelmingly positive feedback that doesn't say anything specific. That's
Yeah.
actually not that useful. That's nice. And I
Yeah.
really appreciate when people do that. But I am looking for feedback that is actionable and respectful.
Yeah.
And if it's not one of those, and I either won't reply, or like if people are mean, I just kind of think of it as whether you're leaving a comment on my YouTube channel or on like a blog post, you're in my house. I get to decide who stays in my house.
Yeah.
And I have like an ethics statement where I talk about exactly what is okay in the communities that I curate and own, and what isn't okay. And just that level of transparency brings a lot of fairness, because I'm not going to be treating people in a different way because I just don't happen to like you or something. I
Yeah.
really try to hold myself to the standard of treating everyone the same way. But
Yeah.
that also means guarding myself and my
Yeah.
feelings, because
Yeah.
I need to do what I need to do to continue to exist on the internet.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Do you know, that's thank you for sharing that. It's really interesting to just think through the reality and the lived experience, of how you take something that's really important to you, like learning in public and helping other people out, and at the same time do that in a world where horrible people are saying horrible things. So thank you for sharing that. Now, I wonder if we could start to segue into how do you do it? So, and the first question, because this is where my alarm bells start ringing, you is it takes a lot of time. So maybe how does this work practically? How do you do it? And could you give us some steps on how we raise our game from scribbling down notes into creating this personal knowledge management system?
All right. So I happen to think that the tool doesn't matter so much. It matters to a certain degree.
Okay.
If you're using a really bad tool, I think that can affect your success with note making or note taking. But beyond that point, I think there are a lot of really good tools on the market. And I mean, you're already using OneNote, totally fine to be using that. I happen to use a tool called Obsidian, and that's obsidian.md, no affiliation with them. It's a free tool. But how I do it is I would first take notes in Obsidian, kind of very stream of consciousness. So this is the stage where I'm not at all trying to think about what looks nice, or it's just bullet points. Yeah, it's mostly bullet points, and I'm just trying to get down what I'm listening to or reading or whatever it is that
And
I'm
would you
making
do this
notes
in
from.
customer meetings as well? So that's sort of
Yes.
so this could be when you're learning, as in I'm trying to learn a technology and I'm using YouTube and I'm using whatever to learn about it, or this could be I'm in a meeting with a customer and I'm trying to understand their problem, their industry, their politics, whatever it is. So you're in Obsidian, typing away your stream of consciousness.
Yeah. So let's say I'm talking to a customer about the problems in their industry, and I might think, okay, well, that's I think where most people stop is after the meeting. It's just like, okay, well, I guess if I ever want to look up that note, I'll just magically remember the name of the customer or when I made it. And that's the
Yeah.
problem, because we don't.
Okay.
You
Okay.
know,
Okay.
you might later, months later, think like, oh yeah, this kind of rings a bell, but who was it? Where was I? What context was it in?
Yeah.
The key is to make sure that it's contextualized after the fact. So there's a guy, I'm blanking on exactly the name of the person that did it. Here it is. I just looked it up in my notes. Richard Saul Wurman. He wrote a book called Information Anxiety, where he talked about a latch approach. And latch is like a way to contextualize information, and I like it for notes as well. So latch stands for a bunch of things, but it stands for location, meaning maybe you want to tag that note with where you were. That could be physically where you were, but it could also be like the conference. A is alphabetization. I mean, if you're using something digital, then it probably is, you probably don't need to worry about that. T is time, C is category, and H is hierarchy. So when I tag a note with these things, it increases the chance that I'll come across it somewhere else. So let's say the customer was talking to me about their problem scaling up their Kubernetes clusters. I would also create a Kubernetes note and then have a link to that customer note. That way, when I look at Kubernetes, I'm like, oh yeah, this customer had issues with it. I might also create a note on scalability.
Okay.
So I'm already thinking of like, what situations would I need to find this note in? I will make sure that there's a link between them.
Okay. So we've done stream of consciousness in a meeting or whatever, and you've then gone through and you've now tagged it. So that's now, what's the next step? What's the next thing you do?
Yeah. So once there's the hyperlinking, then I will start to think about what more abstract things I can pull out of that meeting. You know, maybe the meeting itself is confidential to start with, probably, but problem scaling is not, it's not uncommon, and I can absolutely talk about that. So what are the common problems that this customer also mentioned for why they can't scale? You know, is it the ephemeral nature of Kubernetes? Is it load? You know, are they having issues because of their CDN? None of these are things that are specific to that customer. So I might then start to create other notes or update notes that I already have about, to add these problems that the customer mentioned. And in this way, I'm building not just a single node, but more like a graph of interconnected nodes. It's a network of nodes. And now it's impossible to pluck on one without seeing the ripple effect elsewhere.
Okay. And so, you know, in that example there where you've got Kubernetes, so would you have like a Kubernetes main note page, and you'd be going and adding in these little bits of, let's say, customers with these type, you know, customer problems. You might have a customer problems section on your Kubernetes page, and there you've got those links in there. Or how do you start to structure that a little bit?
Yeah, when I just have the one note, I probably won't even put anything in. I'll make a note that just says Kubernetes, and then here's a link to the note. But then what usually happens is I will then read an article on Kubernetes, and then I'm like, oh, this is another thing that I can add. And once I have enough links, I'm like, okay, hang on. Now I'm starting to see like a structure emerge. One is like the application of Kubernetes, but then there's also Kubernetes theory. All right, let's kind of write this out a little bit and then have, you know, headings for it. So I let my interests dictate how much time I spend on a note. I'm not just going to write a note on Kubernetes before I know if I'm even interested. But the way it has worked out is that, yeah, I do talk a lot or consume a lot of information about Kubernetes, and it is worthwhile to structure it out a little more. And that leads to notes that are reflective of my interests and my passion, because the notes that are the most fleshed out are the ones that I'm most interested in.
Okay. So you've got your notes, you've got them hyperlinked and tagged. You've spent a bit of time thinking about them critically and consolidating them into something that makes a bit more sense. Anything else that you do?
sometimes I will then, because what often happens is at the end of it, I mean, it never really ends, but when it's fully fleshed out enough, or when I have a lot of disparate notes and I'm not really sure how they fit in, like how can I structure this note, I will show that to somebody who is an expert on Kubernetes, for example. And I'll be like,
Okay.
what am I missing here? Did I get it wrong? What would you have wanted to see that I
Yeah.
maybe should also look into? Then it's like, I've identified this as an interest of mine. Now let me show it to somebody who will then give me feedback as to where I can go next for my learning, because it's
Yeah.
something that I want to learn. And
Yeah.
that's part of the benefit of learning in public.
And that could equally be an expert on that particular technology, or that could be going back to the, if you're working with a customer, back to the account manager that owns the relationship with the customer and knows that customer very well, and you can say, this is my understanding of the customer, the problems they're facing and what they're after from us, and you've sort of got that feedback from them as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would go back to the customer as well. I
Yeah.
might do a presentation talk at a conference and get feedback that way. You know, there's all sorts of little ways to kind of remix that and then judge based on the feedback that I get, whether I've hit the mark or not.
Okay. Now, those note pages that I guess you're creating, are they big, long, lengthy? Have you got, like, I guess almost like monolithic pages on topics, or have you got lots of little short little notes that all? How does that work?
Well, I'm looking at my Kubernetes note right now. I did not
Right,
plan to talk
as we're
about this.
talking about it, yeah.
Yeah, but I have a few paragraphs on it, and the rest of it are links. So I
Okay,
used to have just everything on there, but now I have like Kubernetes theory, and then using Kubernetes, then Kubernetes distributions, and each of those are separate pages now.
okay,
So when I was starting, it was just one page because I didn't
yeah,
have that much. But I
yeah,
find that the longer it is, the easier it is to lose interest and kind of get lost in the weeds.
yeah.
So I tend to prefer shorter notes and making them more modular, more atomic.
Okay, okay. Any other note? Any other notes? Any other tips on what you need to do to practically build out that kind of note making system?
Yeah, I would say choose a tool that's going to work for you. For example, one of the reasons that I chose Obsidian is that it does a lot of the work for me. We were talking about the linking earlier. It does a lot of that already, so I don't have to explicitly link to something. When I create a note based on something that I've previously mentioned in other notes, even when I didn't think it was useful then, Obsidian will automatically find those, and it's like instantly contextualized for me. So I really love when tools do that for me, and whatever tool people end up using, I think that they should think about how they're really going to be using it. Like you're already in OneNote. I'd say stick to that. You know, if it's working for you, then go with it. I'd say prioritize owning your own data. So anything that's in a SaaS platform, I personally would be a little bit hesitant to really bank on unless you have a rock solid backup system, because this is your thoughts, this is your personal Google, and it would be a shame if you lost it.
Mm. Yeah. Now, final thing before we wrap up, because I've just looked at the clock. How much time does this actually take you? And we've alluded to it a little bit a couple of times, but how much time do you reckon this actually takes? And how do you do that? Do you structure it at the end of every learning session, or do you do it at the end of the day, or how do you do it, and how much time does it take you?
I tend to do a little bit at the end of the day, especially like if I'm at a conference, I'm not going to stop after every talk and do all of this. I might, at the end of the day, jot down some overall themes that I picked up, and I might spend like 30 minutes doing that, write down everyone that I met, all of the things that I want to follow up on, but still not have it be really structured. After the conference, I might spend an hour or two, depending on how much I got, trying to massage those again. But I think the key is to spend as much time on it as your interest dictates. So if you're not interested in it and you're like, why am I doing this? This is so much work. I don't see the point. Don't do it. It's totally okay to just like leave it at the taking notes stage and move on to the next thing. Only take notes, make notes on the things you're really excited about. And when you do that, and you do come across something that your past self happened to have made extensive notes on, it feels amazing. It's like, thank you, past self, because now I don't have to do all of this work. You are awesome. But that only
brilliant.
works if you're passionate about it, right?
Yeah. Well, on that note, I think we ought to wrap things up. Now, for people that have maybe you've piqued some interest and people that want to develop these skills, I know you've got a great YouTube channel which has got a lot about Obsidian. I think you've got some demos, and you can actually see how you do it as opposed to just imagine it in your brain like we're doing today. So for anybody that wants to get in touch with you and find out more about this, where can they find you?
Yeah, so I think if you want to look into my YouTube channel, I have a URL shortener, so nicole.to /YouTube will get you to the YouTube channel, /site will get you to my site, and from there you can find me everywhere else.
Brilliant. And I'll pop that in the show notes so that anybody can click on the link and take you straight there. Well, Nicole, can I say thank you so much? This has been really interesting. Really enjoyed it. So thank you so much for taking the time to come and talk to us and share with us all your wisdom. So I guess the only final thing to say is thank you very much and bye-bye.
Thank you so much for having me. Bye, everyone.
Well, there we go. Thanks for listening. Remember, if the podcast is not enough for you and you want weekly tips delivered straight to your inbox, sign up for the Elevated You newsletter. Head over to www.techworldhumanskills.com to sign up. Oh, and can you do me a favour? Could you subscribe to the podcast and rate the show? It really helps spread the word.